"Mom, I gave your house to my wife's parents. I thought you were going to die." When my son said those words, he said them so casually, like he was talking about the weather, sigh like he had just borrowed my car without asking. But I was lying in a hospital bed, weak, confused, my head still spinning because I had just opened my eyes after 6 months in a coma. 6 months, ha ha ha, can you imagine losing half a year of your life like that? The room smelled like disinfectant, machines were beeping beside me, and for a moment I thought maybe I was still dreaming. Surely my son didn't just say he gave away my house. Surely I heard it wrong. But no, he stood there with his arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but not sorry. His wife stood behind him, scrolling on her phone like the conversation had nothing to do with her. I swallowed slowly because my throat felt like sandpaper. My voice barely came out when I whispered, "My house." My son rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Yeah, Mom, Jessica's parents needed somewhere to live. And well, you weren't waking up. The doctors said it could be months, maybe years." My chest tightened. 6 months asleep and my entire life had changed. My name is Emily Parker. I am 60 years old. And the house he was talking about, that house was not just a house. Oh no, that house was 25 years of my life. Every wall, every window, every inch of that place was built with my sweat, my tears, and sometimes even my blood. You see, I wasn't always lying in hospital beds listening to my son betray me. Once, a long time ago, I was just a young woman with a husband, a baby, and a dream of building a simple life. I grew up in a small town outside Chicago. My father worked construction and my mother sewed dresses for women at church. We never had much money, but we had pride. My mother always used to tell me something I never forgot. She would look at me very seriously and say, "Emily, never depend on something you didn't earn with your own hands." Back then I didn't understand why she said it so often, but later in life, I understood perfectly. When I was 22, I married David. He was a bricklayer, strong hands, kind smile, quiet personality. He wasn't rich, haha, not even close, but he was honest. And honestly, that was enough for me. 2 years later, we had a son, Michael. I still remember the morning he was born. It was freezing cold outside, the windows of the hospital were foggy, and when the nurse placed that tiny baby in my arms, I started crying immediately. Happy crying, you know, the kind that just spills out without warning. I kissed his forehead and whispered something that now feels almost ironic. I told him, "Don't worry, my baby. Your mom will always take care of you." For a few years, life was peaceful. David worked long hours, but every evening he came home tired and dusty and would scoop Michael up into the air. Our house was small then, just a rented place with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was full of laughter. Ha ha ha, sometimes Michael would run around the kitchen chasing the dog while I cooked dinner and David would pretend to be the referee of their little game. Those were the best years of my life, and then one afternoon everything changed. I was 28 when they knocked on my door. 2 men from David's construction company stood outside holding their helmets in their hands. Their eyes looked sad before they even spoke. I knew instantly something terrible had happened. "Mrs. Parker," one of them said quietly, "there was an accident at the site." My knees went weak before he even finished the sentence. A steel beam had fallen. David died instantly. Just like that, poof, the future we planned disappeared. I was suddenly a widow with an 8-year-old boy and barely any money in the bank. Those first years after David died were brutal. I worked everywhere I could. I cleaned houses in the morning. I cooked food for neighborhood events in the afternoon. At night, I ironed clothes for families who had more money than they knew what to do with. Sometimes I came home so tired my hands were shaking, but every time I looked at Michael sleeping in his little bed, I told myself it was worth it. I promised myself he would never feel the pain of poverty the way I did growing up. And slowly, very slowly, things started to improve. Michael was a good boy, a really good boy. Teachers loved him. Neighbors praised him. When he was 12, he even started helping me carry boxes when I sold pies at the town square. I still remember one afternoon when a woman buying a pie smiled and said, "Emily, you're raising a wonderful young man." Oh, if only she knew how those words would echo in my head years later. When Michael graduated high school, I cried like a baby, not because I was sad, but because we had survived. Against all odds, we had made it. He went to college, I kept working. And after 15 years of saving coins in a little metal cookie tin under my bed, yes, a cookie tin, I finally bought the house my son just casually gave away. It wasn't a mansion, not even close. Just a small brick house with 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, and a backyard with enough space to plant an apple tree. But to me, it was everything. That house meant safety. It meant independence. It meant all those sleepless nights had a purpose. Every morning I would drink coffee on the back patio while looking at that apple tree and think to myself, we made it, Emily, we made it. But the strange thing about life is that sometimes the people you sacrifice the most for become the ones who hurt you the deepest. And looking back now, sigh, I realized the first warning signs started years before my coma, right around the time my son met his wife. And trust me, the moment she walked into my house for the first time, something in my heart whispered that trouble had just arrived. But I ignored it because sometimes a mother wants to believe everything will turn out okay, even when deep down she knows it won't. And what happened next, well, that's where the real story begins. But before I tell you that part, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so much that you never imagined they could betray you? If stories like this interest you, make sure you subscribe to the channel now, because here we tell real-life style stories that might make you laugh, cry, or even whisper, "Wow, I didn't see that coming." And believe me, what happened after my son brought that woman into our lives was something none of us were ready for. When my son first introduced me to Jessica, I remember forcing a polite smile and telling myself not to judge too quickly, because after everything Michael and I had been through, the last thing I wanted was to be the kind of mother who ruined her son's happiness. She arrived at my house one Sunday afternoon wearing a perfectly ironed dress, high heels that clicked loudly against my old wooden floor, and a perfume so strong it filled the entire kitchen. Michael looked at her like she was the most amazing woman in the world. Ha ha ha, the way young men sometimes do when they're deeply in love and a little blind at the same time. "Mom," he said proudly, "this is Jessica." I wiped my hands on my apron and shook her hand. Her grip was light, almost reluctant, and her eyes moved around the room like she was quietly inspecting everything. My curtains, my old couch, the worn edges of my kitchen table. She smiled politely, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Still, I ignored the feeling that settled in my stomach because mothers often convince themselves things will get better with time. We drank coffee together and Michael talked nonstop about how they met at a work event, how funny she was, how smart she was, how she had big dreams for the future. Jessica mostly stayed quiet, occasionally glancing around my house again like someone evaluating a used car before deciding whether it was worth buying. At one point, she gently touched the surface of the wooden table I had painted years ago and said something that sounded innocent at first but somehow made my chest tight. "This house has character," she said slowly. I laughed softly and nodded. "Yes, it does. I fixed most of it myself." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Oh, just that one word, oh," but somehow it sounded like she meant something else. Michael didn't notice, of course. He was too busy smiling at her, completely unaware of the little storm clouds forming around us. Over the next few months, they visited often, and every time Jessica came to the house, I noticed the same small things. She always looked around like she was measuring the place with invisible rulers. Once she commented on my curtains being old. Another time she asked why I hadn't renovated the kitchen yet. One evening she even said, laughing lightly, "Michael deserves a modern home someday, don't you think?" She said it like a joke, but sigh, some jokes hide real thoughts behind them. I tried not to take it personally. I kept telling myself she was young, maybe a little spoiled, maybe used to nicer things. After all, her parents lived in a much bigger house across town. Michael proposed to her less than a year later. When he told me the news, he was glowing with happiness, and of course I hugged him tight and told him I was proud of him. What else could I do? He was my son. The wedding was beautiful in the way expensive weddings often are. It took place in Jessica's parents' large garden with white chairs, roses everywhere, soft music playing under strings of lights. I wore the nicest dress I owned, which honestly wasn't very fancy, but I ironed it carefully that morning and looked at myself in the mirror thinking, "You did well, Emily, your son is getting married." During the ceremony, I watched Michael standing at the altar smiling nervously, and suddenly memories flooded my mind like a river. I saw him as a little boy running across the yard with scraped knees, the same boy who once brought me a crushed flower he had picked from a neighbor's garden and proudly said, "This is for you, Mom." My heart squeezed painfully remembering that moment. Weddings are strange like that. They celebrate a new beginning, but sometimes they also remind you of everything that is quietly ending. After they were married, Michael and Jessica moved into a small apartment downtown. At first things seemed normal. Michael still came to visit me most weekends. We sat on the patio under the apple tree, drank coffee, and talked about his job at the accounting firm, but Jessica didn't come very often. When she did, she usually seemed restless, like she didn't enjoy being there. She would check her phone, sigh softly, and occasionally say things that made the air feel colder. "Your neighborhood is very quiet," she once said. Another time she asked Michael in front of me, "Don't you ever want a bigger place?" Slowly, very slowly, Michael's visits started becoming less frequent. At first it was once every weekend, then every 2 weeks. Then sometimes once a month. Every time I asked if everything was okay, he always said the same thing, "Just busy with work, Mom," and I believed him because that's what mothers do. They believe the best about their children even when small warning signs start appearing. One evening about a year after their wedding, Michael came to visit alone. It was early autumn and the apple tree in the backyard was heavy with fruit. We sat on the patio watching the leaves move in the wind. He seemed distracted, like something was bothering him. Finally, he cleared his throat and said something that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't understand at the time. Mom, have you ever thought about selling this house? I stared at him, thinking maybe I misheard. Selling it, he shrugged awkwardly. I mean, it's pretty big for just you. The money could help you live somewhere nicer. Maybe a modern apartment. For a moment, I just looked at the apple tree, listening to the leaves rustle. This house wasn't just a building to me. It was the proof that I had survived everything life threw at me. Michael, I said gently, this house is my home. Your father helped build the first parts of it. You grew up here. I don't need anything else. He nodded quickly. Yeah, of course. I was just asking. But now, lying in that hospital bed months later, remembering that conversation, I realized something that made a cold chill run through my body. That question hadn't been random at all. It had been a test. A quiet little test to see whether I would give up the house willingly. And when I didn't, well, let's just say the next part of this story shows exactly how far some people will go when they want something badly enough. But before we continue, let me ask you something honestly. If you worked your entire life to build a home with your own hands, would you ever give it away just because someone else thought they deserved it more? If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe because the next part is where everything starts to fall apart. And believe me, what happened the day I collapsed in my kitchen is something I will never forget. The day everything changed started like any other ordinary morning, and maybe that is what makes it so frightening, because sometimes life collapses when you least expect it. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight falls softly through the kitchen window and everything feels calm. I remember humming along with an old country song playing on the radio while I prepared lunch. The smell of apples drifted in from the backyard because my tree was heavy with fruit that season. I even remember thinking to myself how peaceful everything felt. My hands moved slowly as I chopped vegetables, and I was planning to bake a few pies later for the small market downtown that weekend. It had been years since I worked as hard as I once did, but old habits never really leave you. Sometimes I still liked baking, still liked the feeling of doing something with my own hands, but then something strange happened. At first it was just a small wave of dizziness. You know, the kind where the room tilts slightly and you have to grab the counter for balance. I frowned and shook my head a little, thinking maybe I had stood up too quickly. Emily, I muttered to myself, sigh, you're getting old. I even laughed quietly at my own joke, but the dizziness didn't go away. Instead it grew stronger, like the floor itself was slowly sliding under my feet. My vision blurred and the edges of the kitchen began to spin. I grabbed the table, my fingers gripping the wood tightly, trying to steady myself. My heart started beating faster. Something wasn't right. The room twisted again and suddenly my legs felt heavy, like they no longer belonged to me. I tried to walk toward the sink to splash water on my face, but my body refused to cooperate. My foot dragged against the floor. My arm wouldn't move properly. Panic rushed through my chest. What's happening? I whispered, but my voice sounded strange, thick and slow. Then everything collapsed. I remember falling. The cold kitchen floor pressed against my cheek, and the last thing I smelled before the darkness swallowed me was the sweet scent of apples from the yard. After that, nothing. Complete silence, complete darkness. People often imagine a coma like a deep sleep, but that's not what it feels like. It's more like floating in a strange place between worlds. You can't see anything, you can't move, you can't speak, but sometimes you can hear. At first the voices were distant, like echoes underwater. I heard beeping machines, I heard footsteps, I heard unfamiliar voices talking quietly somewhere nearby. Then slowly the sounds became clearer. Severe stroke, someone said. She's in a coma, another voice answered. We'll have to monitor her closely. I wanted to open my eyes, I wanted to tell them I was there, but my body stayed trapped in that heavy darkness. Then one day I heard a voice that made my heart ache even inside that silent prison. Michael, Mom, I don't know if you can hear me. His voice sounded tired, different. The doctors say sometimes people in comas can still hear things. I tried to scream inside my mind. Yes, Michael, I'm here, I can hear you, but of course nothing came out. He sighed deeply. Jessica says we should prepare ourselves for the worst. There was a long pause. I don't know what to do. I wanted to reach out and hold his hand the way I used to when he was little and scared, but again, nothing. My body refused to respond. In the days that followed, at least I think they were days, Michael visited less and less. Sometimes I heard his voice, sometimes nurses talking, sometimes complete silence for what felt like forever. And then one afternoon I heard Jessica for the first time. Her voice was sharp and impatient, just like I remembered. Michael, this hospital is costing a fortune. He answered quietly, she's my mother. I know, Jessica said, sighing loudly, but the doctors said she might never wake up. My heart pounded painfully inside the darkness. What do you want me to do? Michael asked. Jessica's voice softened slightly, the way people do when they're trying to convince someone of something. I'm just saying your mom's house is sitting empty. Silence followed. Then Michael said something that made the darkness around me feel even colder. Jessica, I don't want to talk about that. But Jessica continued anyway. My parents are struggling right now. They sold their house to pay debts. They need somewhere to stay. I felt something twist painfully in my chest. No, no, not my house. Michael didn't answer right away. I could almost hear him thinking. We'll see, he finally said quietly. Weeks or maybe months passed after that conversation. Time didn't make sense anymore, but eventually I began hearing new voices, voices I had never heard before. It's a lovely house, an older man said. Your mother-in-law kept it in good shape. Jessica replied cheerfully, yes, she took very good care of it. My heart felt like it dropped into an endless pit. The next words confirmed my worst fear. You can move in any time, Jessica said. Michael agreed. I wanted to scream so loudly the hospital walls would shake. That was my house, my home, the place I built with 25 years of sacrifice. But in that moment I was just a silent prisoner trapped inside my own body while strangers discussed moving into my life. And the worst part, Michael didn't stop them. He just stood there quietly, allowing it to happen. That moment inside the darkness was the moment something inside me finally broke, not with anger, but with clarity. I realized something that many mothers learn far too late. Sometimes the child you sacrifice everything for becomes the person who takes the most from you, but the story doesn't end there, because the thing Michael and Jessica never imagined, the thing they never prepared for, was the possibility that I might actually wake up. And when I finally opened my eyes 6 months later, the first words my son said were the ones that shattered whatever remained of the old life I thought I had. But what happened after that, well, that's where things take a turn nobody saw coming. And trust me, the next 3 hours would change everything. When I finally opened my eyes after 6 months of darkness, the world felt strangely bright, almost too bright. The hospital lights stung my eyes, and for a moment I thought maybe I was still dreaming. My body felt weak, heavy, like every muscle had forgotten how to work. A nurse noticed my eyes moving, and suddenly the room filled with excitement. Mrs. Parker, oh my goodness, you're awake, she said, rushing out to call the doctor. Within minutes, people surrounded my bed, checking machines, asking questions, shining small lights into my eyes. Do you know your name? The doctor asked gently. My lips moved slowly. Emily, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, dry and fragile. Good, he said with a small smile. You've been in a coma for 6 months. 6 months, hearing that number made my mind spin again. Half a year had disappeared from my life like a page ripped from a book. The doctor continued explaining things about strokes and recovery and therapy, but honestly, most of it sounded like noise in my ears. The only thought echoing in my head was one simple thing, Michael. My son must have been worried sick all this time. A nurse leaned closer and said, we'll call your family right away. My heart warmed slightly at the thought of seeing him. Maybe he had been sitting beside my bed every day praying for me to wake up. Maybe he had been scared the way any loving son would be. I imagined his face lighting up when he saw me awake. That thought comforted me as I rested quietly waiting for him to arrive. 2 hours later the door opened. Michael walked in first, followed by Jessica. I immediately noticed something strange. He didn't run toward me the way I expected. He didn't hug me or grab my hand. He simply stood near the end of the bed looking uncomfortable. Jessica stayed near the door, tapping something on her phone like she had somewhere better to be. I tried to smile, though my face felt stiff. Michael, I whispered. He nodded slightly. Hey mom, just hey mom, not I'm so glad you're alive, not I missed you, just hey mom. My chest tightened, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was nervous, maybe seeing me like this scared him. I slowly reached out my hand toward him, but he hesitated before stepping a little closer. Then he said the words that would change everything. Mom, there's something you should know. His voice sounded almost apologetic, but not quite. My heart began beating faster. What is it? I asked weakly. He rubbed his neck and sighed like someone about to explain a small inconvenience. While you were in the coma, we made some decisions. Jessica finally looked up from her phone, her expression calm, almost bored. Michael continued, your house, we gave it to Jessica's parents. For a moment the room went completely silent. Even the beeping machine beside my bed sounded distant. I blinked slowly, certain I must have misunderstood him. My house, I whispered. He nodded. Yeah, they needed somewhere to live and the house was empty. The doctors said you might not wake up. Jessica added casually, we thought it was the practical thing to do. Practical, that word echoed painfully in my mind. I stared at them both, searching their faces for even the smallest sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But there wasn't one. Michael looked uncomfortable but firm. Jessica looked almost impatient. You'll just need to find somewhere else to live, she said, shrugging slightly. My heart felt like it cracked open in that moment. I had just survived 6 months fighting to stay alive, and the first thing my own son told me was that my home was gone. My house, the house I spent decades building, the house where Michael took his first steps, the house where I planted that apple tree, was now occupied by strangers. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. Strangely, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. Instead, something unexpected happened inside me. A strange calm settled over my thoughts. Because you see, while they believed I had been unconscious all those months, they had no idea I heard everything. Every conversation, every plan, every decision they made while they thought I was gone. I opened my eyes again and looked directly at Michael. "I see," I said quietly. He seemed relieved that I wasn't yelling. Jessica crossed her arms like she had just finished solving a minor problem. But deep inside my mind, something had already begun to change. For the first time in my life, I realized something important. Sometimes silence is more powerful than anger. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one planning the biggest surprise. But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you woke up from a coma and discovered your entire life had been taken away, what would you do? Would you forgive? Would you fight back? Because what happened in the next 3 hours after I left that hospital room, well, let's just say my son and his wife were not prepared for it. And if you enjoy stories like this that make you think, gasp, or even whisper, "No way," make sure you subscribe to the channel now, because the next part of this story is where everything finally begins to turn around. After Michael and Jessica left the hospital room, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced during those 6 months in the coma. The door closed softly behind them, and suddenly it was just me, the faint beeping of the machines, and the quiet hum of the air conditioner above my head. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, letting their words replay in my mind again and again. "We gave your house to my wife's parents." Imagine hearing that sentence after waking up from fighting for your life. For a moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all, but the sound that escaped my throat was closer to a tired sigh. My body was weak, yes, but my mind was now sharper than it had been in years. When you spend 6 months trapped in silence listening to people reveal their true thoughts, you start understanding things differently. And the truth was painfully simple. My son believed I was gone, and while I was lying there helpless, he allowed my entire life to be handed over to someone else. A nurse entered the room later that evening to check my vitals, and she smiled warmly when she saw me awake. "You're doing great, Mrs. Parker," she said kindly. I nodded politely, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. She adjusted the blanket and asked if I needed anything. I almost told her everything right there, about my house, about my son, about the betrayal that had just been placed in my lap like an unwanted gift. But instead I just shook my head and whispered, "No, thank you," because the truth is I didn't need sympathy. What I needed was time to think. And I thought about many things that night. I thought about the little boy Michael used to be, the same boy who once cried when a stray dog got hurt in the street because he wanted to help it. I remembered the way he used to hug me before bed and say, "Good night, Mom. I love you." Those memories hurt more than the betrayal itself, because somewhere along the way that sweet boy had disappeared and been replaced by a man I barely recognized. I wondered when exactly that change happened. Was it when he met Jessica? Was it when he started making more money and began believing he deserved more than the simple life we built? Or maybe it was something quieter, something that slowly grew over time while I was too busy working to notice. But no matter how much I thought about it, one fact remained the same: the house was still mine. I knew that because I never signed anything giving it away, not a single document, not a single paper. And even if my son believed he could simply hand it over like a borrowed sweater, the law didn't work that way. That realization sparked something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time: determination. The next morning the doctor visited my room again. He was pleased with how quickly I was recovering. "You're stronger than we expected," he said with a surprised smile. "Most patients take much longer to regain their strength." I almost laughed. If only he knew what was fueling my recovery. Anger can be a powerful medicine sometimes. He explained that I would likely stay in the hospital a few more days while they monitored my progress. Normally that news might have disappointed me, but not this time, because those few days gave me exactly what I needed: time to prepare. Later that afternoon, I asked the nurse if there was a hospital social worker I could speak to. She looked a little surprised but nodded. "Of course, I can arrange that." About an hour later, a young woman walked into my room carrying a notebook and a calm, professional smile. "Mrs. Parker, I'm here to see how I can assist you," she said kindly. I sat up slightly in the bed, ignoring the ache in my muscles. "I need to ask you something," I said slowly. "If someone allowed people to move into my house without my permission, what would happen?" The social worker frowned slightly, clearly trying to understand the situation. "Is the property legally in your name?" she asked. "Yes," I replied immediately. "Only mine." She nodded thoughtfully and scribbled something in her notebook. "Then no one has the right to give it away or allow others to live there without your consent. Hearing those words felt like a small weight lifting off my chest. The house was still mine. Jessica's parents might be sleeping there, eating dinner at my table, maybe even picking apples from my tree, but legally, they were nothing more than guests who were never invited. "Could you help me contact a lawyer?" I asked quietly. The social worker smiled again. "Of course." And just like that, the first step of my plan quietly began. That evening, while the hospital lights dimmed and the hallway outside grew quieter, I lay in my bed staring out the window at the dark sky. Somewhere across town, strangers were living inside the house I had built with my own hands. They probably believed it was their new home. They probably believed everything had been settled neatly while I was lying helpless in a hospital bed. But what they didn't know was something very simple. I had just woken up. And when a woman who spent 25 years fighting for everything she has finally decides to stand up for herself, well, things can change very quickly. In fact, the very next person who walked into my hospital room would unknowingly set off a chain of events that would lead to a knock on my front door exactly 3 hours after I left that hospital. And trust me, when that knock finally happened, the surprise waiting on the other side was something Michael and Jessica never expected. The next afternoon, the lawyer arrived at my hospital room carrying a worn brown briefcase and the kind of calm expression that told me he had handled difficult situations before. His name was Mr. Davis. He was probably around 50, with gray hair at the temples and reading glasses that he kept sliding up and down his nose while he talked. When he sat down beside my bed, he listened quietly as I explained everything. I told him about my stroke, the 6 months in the coma, the conversations I heard while I couldn't move, and finally the moment my son stood beside my hospital bed and casually told me my house had been given to his wife's parents. Mr. Davis didn't interrupt while I spoke. He simply nodded from time to time, writing small notes in a yellow legal pad. When I finished, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then he leaned back slightly and sighed. "Mrs. Parker," he said gently, "the most important question is very simple. Is the house legally in your name?" I nodded immediately. "Only mine. I bought it myself years ago." He adjusted his glasses and gave a small, thoughtful hum. "And you never signed any documents giving your son permission to make decisions for you? No power of attorney?" "Never," I answered firmly. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Then the situation may be simpler than you think." Hearing that sentence felt like the first real breath I had taken since waking up. "What do you mean?" I asked. He tapped his pen against the notebook. "Your son had no legal authority to give your property to anyone. If the title is still under your name, then the people currently living there are technically occupying the property without the owner's permission." For the first time since that terrible conversation with Michael, I felt something inside my chest loosen. The house was still mine. My furniture might be moved, my walls repainted, strangers might be sleeping in my bedroom, but legally the house still belonged to me. Mr. Davis continued explaining things in a calm voice. "The first thing I'll do is verify the property records at the county registry. If nothing has been transferred, then we can take immediate steps to recover your home." "How long would that take?" I asked quietly. He shrugged slightly. "It depends, but if everything is clear, we could request an eviction order rather quickly." Eviction order. The word sounded strange to me. For 25 years, I had been the woman welcoming people into my house. Neighbors, friends, Michael's childhood classmates, even stray dogs sometimes. The idea that I would now be legally removing people from that same home felt almost surreal. But life has a strange way of forcing people into roles they never expected. Before leaving, Mr. Davis asked me to sign a few authorization papers so he could investigate on my behalf. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name, but the signature was still strong and clear. Emily Parker. When he finished gathering his papers, he stood and gave me a reassuring nod. "Try to get some rest," he said. "I'll start working on this immediately." After he left, the hospital room felt quiet again. I leaned back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling, letting everything sink in. Somewhere across the city, Jessica's parents were probably relaxing in my living room, watching television on furniture that used to belong to me. Maybe they were cooking dinner in my kitchen. Maybe they believed the house was theirs now. The thought made a bitter little laugh escape my lips. Ha ha ha, people can become very comfortable inside other people's lives when they think the owner is gone, but the truth was simple. I wasn't gone anymore. The following morning, Mr. Davis called the hospital room with the first real update. His voice sounded more serious than before. "Mrs. Parker, I went to the property registry this morning." My heart immediately started beating faster. "And," I asked, "the ownership of the house is still entirely under your name," he said clearly. Relief washed over me like warm sunlight. "But," he continued, and that single word tightened my chest again, "there is a document I need to ask you about." My stomach dropped. "What document?" There was a small pause on the line. A temporary occupancy agreement was filed 3 months ago allowing a couple named Frank and Sarah Miller to live in the property for 2 years. Frank and Sarah Miller. Jessica's parents, my fingers curled around the phone slowly. I never signed anything like that, I said quietly. That's exactly what concerned me, Mr. Davis replied. The document includes a power of attorney supposedly signed by you authorizing your son to act on your behalf. For a moment the room felt cold. My voice came out almost as a whisper. But I never signed any power of attorney. Another short silence followed before the lawyer spoke again. I suspected that might be the case. I compared the signature on that document with other public records containing your signature. I held my breath. They don't match, he said firmly. The meaning of those words hit me slowly but powerfully. My son hadn't just given my house away while I was unconscious. He had forged my signature to make it happen. My chest felt tight as a mix of sadness and disbelief washed over me. Of all the things I expected from Michael in life, forging my name on legal documents had never been one of them. What does that mean? I finally asked. Mr. Davis answered calmly. It means the document is fraudulent, and it means we can request immediate eviction of the occupants. It also means your son could face serious legal consequences. I closed my eyes and sighed slowly. Even after everything that had happened, hearing that word, consequences, attached to my son still hurt more than I expected. I don't want him to go to jail, I murmured softly. The lawyer's voice softened slightly. That may be avoidable. If the house is returned voluntarily and the forged document is admitted, we might resolve the situation without criminal charges. I opened my eyes again and looked out the hospital window at the cloudy sky beyond the glass. Somewhere out there my house was waiting, the house where Michael took his first steps, the house where I planted that apple tree, the house that strangers believed belonged to them now. I took a deep breath and spoke quietly but firmly. Then let's get my house back, Mr. Davis responded without hesitation. Understood, I'll file the eviction request today. As I hung up the phone, I realized something important. Michael and Jessica believed the story was already finished. They believed the quiet woman who raised him had been erased by a stroke and 6 months of silence. But the truth was far more interesting than that. Because the next 48 hours would lead to a knock on my front door that no one inside that house would ever forget. And when that door finally opened, the surprise waiting outside would change everything. The next 2 days felt longer than the entire 6 months I had spent in that coma. Waiting can be strange like that. When you are unconscious, time disappears completely, but when you are awake and expecting something important, every hour suddenly feels like a full day. My strength slowly returned while I stayed in the hospital. The nurses helped me walk down the hallway, holding my arm the first few times because my legs still felt unsteady, but each step made me stronger. And honestly, the determination in my chest was doing more for my recovery than any medicine they gave me. I kept thinking about my house, my little brick house with the apple tree in the yard. I imagined the sunlight falling across the kitchen table in the morning the way it always had. I imagined the sound of the back door opening to the patio where I used to drink coffee every day. Those memories reminded me exactly why I was fighting so hard to get it back. On the second afternoon, Mr. Davis called again. His voice sounded confident this time. Mrs. Parker, the judge, approved the emergency eviction request. My heart jumped. Already? I asked, surprised. Yes, he replied. Because of the forged documents, the court considered it an urgent matter. For a moment, I just sat there quietly holding the phone. It was actually happening. So, what happens now? I asked. The sheriff will deliver the eviction notice tomorrow morning, Mr. Davis explained. They will have to leave the property immediately. Hearing those words felt strange. Not joyful exactly, but satisfying in a quiet way. Justice rarely feels dramatic in real life. It usually arrives calmly, like someone knocking on a door. After I hung up the phone, I stared out the hospital window again, letting the news sink in. Somewhere in my house, Jessica's parents were probably going about their normal day completely unaware of what was coming. Maybe they were cooking dinner in my kitchen again. Maybe they were sitting on my couch watching television. Maybe they had even started believing the house truly belonged to them. I sighed softly and shook my head. People can convince themselves of many things when they want something badly enough. Later that evening, Michael finally called the hospital. The nurse handed me the phone with a small smile, clearly assuming it was a sweet family moment. If only she knew. Mom, Michael's voice came through the line sounding nervous. Yes, I answered calmly. I heard you're getting better. I am. There was an awkward silence before he spoke again. Listen, Jessica told me you were upset about the house. I almost laughed. Upset. What a gentle word for what had actually happened. Michael, I said quietly, did you sign a document using my name? The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I already knew the answer. Finally, he sighed. Jessica said it would make things easier. His voice sounded small, almost ashamed. So that's a yes, I replied. Mom, we thought you weren't going to wake up. That sentence again, it seemed to be his favorite excuse. I closed my eyes for a moment, but I did wake up, I said softly. Another long pause followed. What are you going to do? He asked. I leaned back slightly against the hospital pillow. I'm getting my house back. His breath caught audibly on the phone. Mom, please don't do this. Jessica's parents have nowhere else to go. The irony of that statement made a quiet laugh escape my lips. Ha ha ha, sometimes life has a very strange sense of humor. Michael, I said slowly, when I woke up from that coma, you told me to find somewhere else to live. The line went silent again. He had no answer for that. Finally, he whispered, Jessica is going to be furious. There it was again, Jessica, always Jessica. I realized something very clearly in that moment. My son was no longer making decisions for himself. He was simply reacting to whatever storm his wife created. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said calmly, but the eviction notice will be delivered tomorrow morning. Eviction, he repeated, shocked. Yes, another long silence filled the call, then he spoke in a low voice I barely recognized. You're serious? Very, he exhaled slowly like someone accepting something unavoidable. I'll tell them, he said quietly. That might be wise, I replied. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table beside my bed and stared at it for a long time. Part of me still wished things had turned out differently. Part of me wished the little boy who once brought me flowers from the neighbor's garden had grown into a man who would defend his mother instead of forging her signature. But wishing doesn't change reality. Reality was already moving forward. The next morning, the hospital discharged me. The doctor gave me a list of medications and strict instructions about rest and recovery. I nodded politely through all of it, though my mind was focused on something else entirely. I stepped outside the hospital entrance just after 9 o'clock. The fresh air felt wonderful after days inside that quiet building. For the first time since waking up, I felt like myself again. A taxi driver helped me into the back seat, and I gave him the address of a nearby street, not my own house, but close enough to walk the rest of the way. As the car moved through the city, I watched the familiar streets pass by the window. Every corner reminded me of another memory from the life I had built here. The taxi stopped 2 blocks away from my house. I paid the driver and stepped out slowly, taking a deep breath. The morning air smelled like rain. As I walked down the sidewalk, my heart beat faster with every step. At the end of the street, I finally saw it, my house. The same brick walls, the same small porch, the same apple tree in the yard, but something about it felt different now, like seeing an old friend after a long separation. Parked in front of the house was a white sheriff's vehicle. Mr. Davis stood beside it talking to a uniformed officer. When he saw me approaching, he gave a small nod. Good morning, Mrs. Parker, he said. Good morning, I replied quietly. The officer checked his watch. 10 o'clock exactly, he said. Then he walked up the steps and knocked firmly on my front door. 3 loud knocks echoed through the quiet street. Inside the house, I heard movement, footsteps, a chair scraping the floor. The door handle slowly turned, and when that door finally opened, the look on the faces staring back at us was something I will never forget. The door opened slowly, almost cautiously, like the person on the other side already knew something was wrong. When it finally swung wide enough for us to see inside, Frank, Jessica's father, stood there looking confused and tired. His gray hair was messy, and he was wearing the same plaid shirt I had seen through the window days earlier. For a moment he simply stared at the sheriff, then at Mr. Davis, and finally his eyes landed on me standing a few steps behind them. The expression on his face changed instantly. Shock, pure shock. It was the kind of look people make when they see someone they believed was gone forever. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. Behind him, I could hear movement inside the house, drawers closing, footsteps across the floor, the faint sound of someone whispering. Mr. Frank Miller, the sheriff asked calmly, holding a folded document in his hand. Frank swallowed and nodded slowly. Yes, that's me. The officer handed him the paper. This is an eviction order issued by the county court. The property owner has requested immediate removal of all occupants. Frank's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper and scanned the words. His eyes moved quickly across the page before he looked up again, clearly shaken. Eviction, that must be a mistake. Mr. Davis stepped forward slightly. There is no mistake. The house belongs to Mrs. Emily Parker. Frank's eyes slowly shifted toward me again, disbelief written all over his face. But we were told, he started to say, his voice trailing off. I finally stepped forward, my body still a little weak but my voice steady. You were told wrong. Hearing my own words echo in the doorway of my house felt strangely powerful. Frank looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under his feet. Behind him, Sarah, Jessica's mother, appeared in the hallway clutching a dish towel in her hands. When she saw me standing there alive, her face went completely pale. Oh my, she whispered under her breath. For a long moment nobody moved. The air felt thick with tension like the calm before a storm. Finally, the sheriff cleared his throat gently. "You have 30 minutes to gather your belongings and leave the property," he said firmly but politely. 30 minutes, Sarah gasped. "We just moved in here," the officer nodded calmly. "And now you'll need to move out." Frank rubbed his forehead with one hand, clearly overwhelmed. "Michael told us everything was legal," he muttered quietly. I almost laughed at that. Ha ha ha, the same Michael who forged my signature and hoped I would never wake up. Life has a funny way of exposing the truth eventually. I stepped into the doorway slowly, my eyes scanning the living room behind them. The sight hit me like a wave. My house looked completely different. The old couch I had owned for years was gone. In its place sat a large leather sofa I had never seen before. The curtains were different too, long gray ones replacing the faded floral curtains I had sewn myself. Even the walls had been repainted a bright white color that made the room feel unfamiliar. For a second my chest tightened painfully, but I forced myself to stay calm, because the house itself was still here. The walls still stood. The floors still held the footsteps of my entire life. Those things could not be erased by new paint and unfamiliar furniture. Sarah stepped aside awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do now. You're really alive," she said quietly, almost like she was still trying to process the situation. I nodded once. "Yes, I am." Frank looked toward the sheriff again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Can we at least call Michael?" The officer shrugged slightly. "You can call whoever you like, but the order still stands." Frank quickly pulled out his phone and stepped outside onto the porch, dialing with shaky hands. I could hear his low voice speaking urgently into the phone. "Michael, you need to get here, right now." Inside the house, Sarah stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, clutching that dish towel like it was the only thing holding her together. "We thought," she started to say softly, but then she stopped, clearly realizing there was no sentence that could fix what had happened. I walked slowly into the living room, taking in every detail of the changes they had made. My old coffee table was gone. My photos had disappeared from the shelves. Even the small rug I had bought years ago at a flea market was nowhere to be seen. It felt like walking into a stranger's house that just happened to have the same walls as mine. But even so, the smell of the place was still familiar. The faint scent of apples drifting in from the backyard reminded me instantly that the tree was still there, the tree I planted with my own hands. The tree Michael once climbed when he was little. That thought made my throat tighten again, but I pushed it aside. Right now wasn't the time for old memories. The sheriff checked his watch again. 25 minutes, he said calmly. Sarah hurried into the bedroom to start packing, while Frank continued pacing nervously outside on the porch, speaking into his phone. From inside the living room, I could hear pieces of his conversation drifting through the open door. "Michael, she's here, yes, alive. The sheriff is here too, they're evicting us." I stood quietly in the center of the room while everything unfolded around me. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life from the outside. But in truth, this was my life, my house, my decision, and the most surprising part was that I didn't feel angry anymore. Not really. What I felt instead was something quieter, something stronger. Closure. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it simply arrives with a knock on the door and a piece of paper that says the truth has finally caught up. But what happened next, when Michael's car suddenly pulled into the driveway 10 minutes later? Well, that moment was something none of us were fully prepared for. About 10 minutes after the sheriff knocked on my door, the quiet street suddenly filled with the sound of tires rushing across the pavement. A dark car turned sharply into the driveway and stopped so quickly the brakes squealed. The driver's door flew open before the engine was even fully off. Michael stepped out looking pale and breathless, like he had driven there as fast as the car would allow. His eyes moved quickly between the sheriff, the lawyer, and finally landed on me standing in the doorway of the house he thought I would never return to. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. I could see confusion, guilt, and panic all fighting across his face at the same time. "Mom," he finally said quietly, almost like he wasn't sure if the words still belonged to him. Frank immediately walked toward him, waving the eviction paper in the air. "Michael, what is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "The sheriff says we have to leave right now." Michael grabbed the paper and read it quickly, his face growing paler with every second. When he finished, he looked up at me again. "You filed an eviction?" he asked, disbelief clear in his voice. I crossed my arms gently, leaning slightly against the doorframe because my legs were still recovering their strength. "The house belongs to me," I said calmly. "Of course I did." Sarah stepped onto the porch behind him, clutching a half-packed box of kitchen dishes. Her voice trembled. "We didn't know," she said softly. "Michael told us everything was handled." Michael rubbed his forehead in frustration, pacing across the driveway like a man trying to wake up from a bad dream. "Mom, this didn't have to happen," he said finally. They're already living here. I tilted my head slightly and looked at him carefully. So was I replied quietly. That simple sentence hung in the air for a long moment. Frank exhaled heavily and set the box down on the porch floor. We were told you wouldn't wake up, he said honestly. I nodded slowly. Yes, I know. None of them realized how true that statement really was. They had all spoken so freely when they thought I was trapped in silence. Every plan, every decision, every excuse, they had all floated through the darkness while I listened without being able to move. Michael finally looked directly into my eyes again, and for the first time since arriving, he seemed less defensive and more ashamed. Mom, I didn't think you'd come after them like this, he said quietly. I sighed softly. You didn't think I'd wake up either. He had no response for that. The sheriff cleared his throat gently and glanced at his watch again. 10 minutes remaining, he announced calmly. Frank nodded reluctantly and went back inside to continue packing. Sarah followed him, wiping her eyes quietly with the edge of her sleeve. Michael remained in the driveway, standing awkwardly between me and the house like a man caught between two worlds. Finally, he stepped closer to me and lowered his voice. Mom, can we talk? I looked at him for a long moment before nodding once. We walked a few steps away from the porch toward the apple tree in the yard. Seeing that tree again up close stirred a strange mix of memories in my chest. I remembered planting it when Michael was just 17. He had helped dig the hole himself, laughing the whole time because the dirt kept sticking to his shoes. I reached out and gently touched one of the branches while he stood beside me silently. You remember planting this tree? I asked quietly. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I remember. For a moment we both looked at the apples hanging from the branches above us. Then he spoke again, his voice softer now. Jessica pushed for this whole thing, he admitted quietly. I didn't seem surprised. I figured, I said. He sighed heavily. Her parents were struggling financially. She kept saying your house was empty and it made sense to let them stay there. I turned toward him again. And forging my signature made sense too? He winced slightly at that. I didn't forge it, he said quickly. Jessica's friend handled the paperwork. I just signed where they told me. I raised one eyebrow slightly. Michael, that's still fraud. He looked down at the ground, kicking a small rock with his shoe like a child who knew he had done something wrong. I thought you'd never know, he admitted quietly. I let out a slow breath. That's the problem, Michael. You thought I was gone. He didn't argue with that because he couldn't. Behind us, the sound of boxes being moved echoed through the house, drawers closing, cabinets opening. The life they had briefly built inside my home was already being packed away again. Michael looked back toward the house and shook his head. Jessica is going to lose her mind when she hears about this, he muttered. I gave a small, tired laugh. She probably will. Then I looked at him seriously again. But that's not my problem. The sheriff called out from the porch. 5 minutes remaining. Michael ran his hands through his hair again, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. I studied his face carefully. For the first time in this entire mess, he looked less like the man Jessica had turned him into and more like the boy I once raised. Lost, confused. Unsure of what to do next. You can start by telling your wife the truth, I said calmly. He looked at me again. And what truth is that? I stepped back toward the porch, my voice steady. That some things in life can't be taken just because someone thinks they deserve them. He didn't answer, and honestly, I wasn't expecting him to. Behind us, the front door opened again as Frank and Sarah carried the last of their boxes outside. Their short stay inside my house was finally ending. But the most surprising part of this entire story was still waiting just around the corner, because when Jessica arrived a few minutes later and saw the sheriff standing in front of the house she thought was hers, the reaction that followed was something none of us would ever forget. Just as Frank and Sarah carried the last box out of the house and placed it beside their car, another vehicle suddenly turned onto the street and rolled quickly toward the driveway. The engine stopped, the door slammed, and Jessica stepped out looking furious before she had even taken 2 steps forward. Her eyes moved quickly from the sheriff's car to the pile of boxes on the lawn, and then finally landed on me standing on the porch of the house she believed she had secured for her parents. The moment she realized what was happening, her face turned bright red. What is going on here? She demanded sharply, marching toward Michael. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been arguing with reality all morning. Jessica, it's over, he said quietly. She stopped in front of him, completely ignoring the sheriff, the lawyer, and even her own parents standing beside their half-packed car. What do you mean it's over? She snapped. Tell them to stop this right now. Michael shook his head slowly. I can't. For a moment Jessica simply stared at him as if her brain refused to accept the words, then she turned toward me. Mrs. Parker, she said with forced politeness that barely hid her anger, this is completely unnecessary. My parents have already moved in. I folded my arms and looked at her calmly. And now they're moving out. The silence that followed was almost dramatic. Jessica blinked in disbelief. You can't just throw people out like this. I almost laughed. Hahaha, sometimes people forget the most obvious fact when they want something badly enough. Actually, I said gently, I can, it's my house. Jessica opened her mouth to argue again, but the sheriff spoke first. Ma'am, the eviction order is valid. The property owner has requested the occupants leave immediately. She looked at the officer like he had just insulted her personally. This is ridiculous, she muttered, running her hands through her hair in frustration. Behind her, Frank sighed heavily and shut the trunk of the car where he had been placing the last box. Sarah stood quietly beside him with tired eyes, clearly wishing the whole situation would simply disappear. Michael stepped closer to Jessica, lowering his voice. Jess, we need to go. She turned on him immediately. Go where? He hesitated. Back to the apartment. That answer seemed to drain the last bit of control she had left. Back to the apartment, she repeated loudly. After everything we did, I watched them quietly from the porch, feeling strangely calm despite the chaos unfolding in front of me. It's amazing how peaceful a person can feel once they finally stop allowing others to walk all over them. Jessica finally turned back toward me again, her voice sharp. You're really going to do this to your own son? That question might have hurt me once, but now it simply made me sigh. No, I said softly, your husband did this to himself. Michael didn't argue. He just stood there looking tired, the weight of his choices finally settling onto his shoulders. Frank walked toward him slowly and placed a hand on his arm. It's all right, he said quietly. We'll figure something out. Sarah nodded beside him. Yes, we will. Their calm reaction seemed to surprise Jessica even more. She looked between them all like she couldn't understand why the world wasn't bending to her will anymore. Eventually Michael took a deep breath and turned toward the car. Come on, he said quietly. Let's go. Jessica stood there for another few seconds, clearly struggling with the situation. But finally she grabbed her purse and followed him without another word. The car doors slammed again, the engine started, and within seconds they were driving away down the street. Frank and Sarah left shortly after, their car moving slowly past the apple tree before disappearing around the corner. When the street finally became quiet again, the sheriff nodded politely toward me. Everything seems settled now, Mrs. Parker. I nodded back. Thank you. Mr. Davis shook my hand before leaving as well, satisfied that the legal work had reached its conclusion. Soon it was just me standing alone in front of the house again. My house. I walked slowly back inside through the open front door. The living room was still messy from the rushed packing, but the walls felt familiar again. The sunlight coming through the window landed exactly where it always had on the wooden floor. I stepped out into the backyard and looked at the apple tree swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. For a moment I just stood there quietly. Then a small laugh escaped my lips. Ha ha ha, life has a funny way of correcting itself sometimes. 6 months ago I had been lying on a hospital floor thinking everything was over. But here I was again, standing in the yard I planted with my own hands. My life hadn't been taken away after all. It had simply been waiting for me to come back and claim it. And if there is one thing I learned from this entire experience, it's something very simple. Sometimes the people who believe you are finished are the ones who are most surprised when you stand back up. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful real-life style stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel now. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and trust me, some of them are even more unbelievable than this one.